Welcome to Evolve, Reinventing Leadership, Building Freedom Cultures, with thought leader and award-winning author Yvette Bethel. This podcast provides you with insights and ideas you can use to reinvent your culture through trust and the principles of interconnectivity, flow, and balance. At a time when the world is rewriting the rules of work, traditional leadership practices are not enough. It's time to perceive persistent challenges through a new lens. It's time to evolve. Hello, everyone, and welcome once again. This is your host, Yvette Bethel, and I have with us kind of like a new co-host, Edwin Clapp, who's joining us for this Future of Leadership series. This is the third in that installment, and we're going to talk about trust today. Edwin, you want to say a little bit about yourself once again?
Yeah, so I have done many things over my career, so it's not really easy for me to say I'm this or that. I've been a professor, I've been a scientist and engineer, um, and I have done a lot of work in recent years looking at the implications, the philosophical implications, and how that translates down into real world problems uh, of quantum physics. So, what can we learn from this new field of science?
Mm-hmm.
And how can we apply that to businesses and organizations?
Mm-hmm. I think one of the challenges that people have is they get into what to do and they don't always talk about how it's done. And I think for ecosystems, there needs to be something that connects people that's in there. And in control models, the thing that connects people is probably fear or obligation, duty, even loyalty can connect people. But those are not high quality binding factors. In particular, loyalty is not when it's not an outcome of trust. When it's an outcome of ambition and some of those other kinds of drivers that are not associated with trust, it can cause mutations in the culture. So today we're going to talk about trust because trust is one of the highest quality binding factors that exists because it doesn't create those kinds of power distortions. It actually diffuses power, causes the power to kind of play out and balance itself. If it's allowed to, it naturally does that. So does love. Love can do that as well when it's healthy. So we're going to zoom in on trust today. I don't know if you have something to add to that.
Well, I think Yvette, you and I started talking about this topic a number of years ago, and I think we had some very enlightening discussions. But it has continued to hold a very prominent place in my thinking. How trust, as you described it, it's one of the mediums of interconnectivity. So when you look at your IFB model, interconnectivity, flow, and balance, the trust is, in a sense, the glue that holds people together.
Yes.
And I think one of the things that I see kind of on a meta level is when you look at our society and you look at the way people think, how we've been taught to think, we're very much biased towards the separation, our competition, the other department, China as the other. Or we tend to see the world through this lens that amplifies separation, which is a state of low trust. You don't trust the other that you've been separated from because you don't know what their social script is. They're not predictable, right? So we have a culture that is biasing our organizations towards a low trust state.
That's right.
And I think as you shift your thinking to some of these new ways of thinking we've talked about, like the ecosystem model and quantum leadership and things like that, you really have to take stock of what are some of the root artifacts in our way of thinking and how is that biasing us and how are we going to then approach things differently with new ways of thinking. And I think uh, trust is a very, very powerful thing that allows us to accomplish great things. So it's something that we should be desiring, right? It's a high capability function to have in your organization, something that we should really be pursuing aggressively.
You know, and you're right, it should be happening, but trust is not an easy sell because what it does is, especially in highly toxic political environments, trust building has a way of shining the light in corners and crevices that people don't want the light to
Right.
be kind
Right.
of put on. So it's actually not something that's supported because everybody has a skeleton or two in the career closet,
Right.
and and or the team closet. And it's really important to understand that even though it's one of the things that when you think about HR, culture, anything to do with people, there's always a trust component, but there's not always a trust component to the solution.
Right. Right. Absolutely. Um, there's so much to unpack here that I do think that we can look at some changes that have happened in business, for example, and see illustration of how thinking has advanced. I think in our last podcast we talked a little bit about how thinking within verticals and supply chains have changed. We went from the old school way of thinking to see one's suppliers as the adversary to conquer. So we want to drive the supplier prices down. We want to get the best deal so that we can make the most money. So it's this very self-centered, I want to maximize my advantage and I will do it at the expense of everybody around me, the expense of the customers, the expense of my suppliers, all of these things. That's kind of the old school way of thinking. As our world has increased in complexity, we have started to recognize that we have relationships with these people in our chain. We have customer relationships, we have supplier relationships, and those are really strategic to the success of one's business, right? Especially as we've as suppliers have consolidated. I mean, you may have a supplier, they're not your company, right? But they are essential to your company's function. Without them, you cease to exist, right? So we have seen this progression in thinking where relationships to which trust was superfluous in the past, now that is becoming central. We want to have a very trusting relationship with those strategic suppliers. We want to build our brand in a way that engenders trust with our customers. We don't want to do things in our corporate life where we are somehow betraying the trust of our customers.
Mhm.
So even in kind of contemporary progression of management theory, you're starting to see this layer of trust coming in. But I think that we can go even deeper than that. I mean, I think the topic of trust within organizations, within your own stable, as it were, is something that still has not progressed to the level that we need it to be.
You know, what you're describing kind of takes me back to the fact that in toxic environments, interactions tend to be transactional. Like, I've seen many environments where people are just getting the work done. They're not really getting to know each other, helping each other, supporting each other, being there, nothing.
Right,
There's no belonging. There's just
right,
the work. The work is the central kind of connector. And in many cases, one of the binding factors that I talk about is exactly that, the goals, having shared goals or shared vision. The trouble is when that's not undergirded by trust, it mutates because people can start jockeying for power. They can start, being competitive. They can do many things that kind of take you away from the safety of trust. But why one thing that I notice, organizations don't pay attention to it because it drives results, and it can drive high performing results even though people are not trusting each other.
Yeah. Well, and I think again, what you see here is um, we have these artifacts of thought that are percolating to the top here. So yes, you can achieve results by violating trust, but you're going to do that in the short term, not the long term. So
Mhm.
you see a lot of this in corporate publicly traded companies. They're all about their quarterly earnings, and they will do whatever they need to do to make their quarterly earnings go, and that's all tied in with executive bonuses and things like that. So we've created this system that is essentially uh, incentivizing behavior that is counter to trust.
Mhm.
What we do see in some cases, you see this more in privately held companies where they're not under that very short-term pressure, where they're looking at long-term success. We see those companies able to commit to longer-term trust building uh, uh, behaviors. So
The-
I think when it comes to trust, excuse me, what was that? We have to recognize that
oh,
um,
wait a minute. Oh my
yes,
God, I started recording and I don't think
stop.
I didn't record. I thought
Oh,
I,
we will. No, it says recording on my screen.
oh, sorry. Let me make,
No, it's okay.
oh, okay. Sorry, I cut you off.
It's all right. But let me get my thought back again here.
Well, you talked about violating trust and being short-term focused. And I think what organizations have done is they created a short-term focused system over the long term. So instead of
Right,
having a long-term focus, they have these mini kind of rotations where people come in, they get burnt out, they leave.
right,
And then new people come in, they get burnt out, they leave, or they quietly quit. As
right.
that's more of what's going on nowadays. So uh,
Well,
go ahead.
yeah, I think, when you're talking about that, what I'm seeing in my mind of that is the machine
Hmm.
and how we think about maintaining machine. We're
Hmm.
gonna you would see this in a business environment. It's a capital asset. You want to maximize your return on that investment of your capital asset. You're going to run that machine as hard as you can. And when a cog breaks, you're just going to replace the cog. Okay. When some piston breaks, you're going to replace the piston. And so this kind of very short-term mechanistic transactional way of thinking that we've been educated into as the way to maximize our profit, which is the only objective generally that's being pursued in those cases, is this mechanistic way of thinking, which really goes back to kind of Isaac Newton's clockwork universe. It's the same mode of thinking, right? Now fast forward into the future. Let's transition our thinking to the ecosystem. You
Right.
can't do those things. You can't just take this frog out of the environment because their presence is integral within that web. You take one organism out and you disrupt the food chain, you disrupt all kinds of things happening. You're disrupting the entire system. And so I think when we have this mode of thinking that prioritizes the the functional unit is the individual and individuals are replaceable, it leads to one set of behavior. When we look at the functional unit as the ecosystem and everything within that ecosystem is integral, all of a sudden we have to manage it in a completely different way. And that's where you get your behavioral change happening.
One thing that I would clarify though is ecosystems can once the natural laws of interconnectivity, flow, and balance are operationalized, um, low quality connections can be viable because that's why the transactional works, and it can drive high performance, but it also drives burnout, apathy, and a number of other things. Um, or just, yeah, people burn out because they're constantly what's vigilant. They have to be constantly vigilant. And
Right,
so it's the system will work either way, but it's not optimized when the connected factors are not trust-based or love-based.
right, right. And I think one of the things that I see happening in the two different ways of having these systems is the people in the end are going to be driven by some kind of survival narrative. I'm going to do what I need to do to
Yeah,
get by and survive within this context. When you frame that survival narrative for an employee or somebody in your organization as you do your task, because we're going to evaluate your performance, and if you're not meeting these metrics, you're out of here.
yeah,
That
or
person is
else.
going to shift all their energy into doing that thing because that is what they've been told how to survive.
Yes.
We shift to that ecosystem thinking, and there's this African saying, which is the meaning of the word Ubuntu is uh, I am because we
We
are. It's
are,
this
yeah,
collective thinking. And when you craft a narrative of not only survival, but flourishing, like we will flourish collectively, which is what Ubuntu means. It's like my existence is tied in with your success. So when you shift this, people will, they're still motivated by the survival instinct. I want to secure my place in this world. But now that is taking on the form of cooperation, which engenders trust. Trust has many, many benefits. It lowers your overhead, your bureaucracy. There's so many things that trust brings in terms of efficiency to your
costs.
systems.
Mhm. Uh, uh, Ubuntu is a powerful message, and I think people try to replicate it, but to me, when I excuse me, watch it in action in Africa, they have a completely different worldview.
They do.
They see each other and experience each other as being one. So if
Mhm.
one person's hungry, that affects the whole.
Right.
That isn't the experience in Western nations.
Right.
Um, and so at the very most, I think they replicate the look of it. So it looks like collaboration, it looks like support, but there's something much deeper
Yes.
at play with Ubuntu. And to me, that's what the trust has the potential to bring out
Right.
because you drop all those barriers and you can truly connect. And you're not going to connect with everybody in exactly the same way because that's not the way the trust works. But collectively, you can move the trust up, several notches together, not
Mhm.
not necessarily separately, because people tend to look on the outside when they are thinking about trust. You mentioned this earlier, and trust is an inside out process. It's not outside in, which people try to, that's another
Mhm.
worldview or mechanism that they use to kind of put trust in a box, but it doesn't work in outside in. It has to be inside out.
Right. Right. And I think that talking about from the inside, this is where I think leadership in organizations has to start doing the deep work.
Mhm.
They can't serve two masters.
Yeah.
Is their success their quarterly earnings? If it is, then they're gonna serve that master and they're gonna do whatever they need to do to hit their bonus goal or whatever's driving them. But if we're talking about long-term success, and I'll say this, long-term success is interrelated with our idea of sustainable organizations and business. Uh, if we are talking about a more sustainable future, we are talking about long-term uh, evolving organizations
Right.
that bring stability to our economic and social environment. So I think we have to recognize that in order to get there, the kind of leadership that is required is one that's coming from the inside.
Hmm.
It's not your MBA mindset, which is metrics driven. It's the high EQ person who's able to evaluate the relationships, which are the threads of that trust fabric, as it were. They're
Yeah.
able to evaluate that, and almost like you would do if you're weaving threads on a loom, you have to be able to keep the tensions of the threads where they need it to be. If you have one thread that's too tense and it breaks, that ruins your whole cloth, right? So we have to become skilled at building these high trust social fabrics and creating a narrative that allows people to shift out of that place of fear into a place of confidence where they are uh, empowered to act in the interest of everybody else. Not, and I think I mean, we've both been in the workplace many, many years now. So many people are acting out of fear, the cover your ass mentality. It's like the dominant behavioral driver because we have low trust environments. And that starts with the leadership example.
I was thinking of an example. I was in a meeting the other day, and they were talking about building I guess a community that's based on these things, and they brought in trust and trust-like kinds of core values, not exactly trust, but and 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 the conversation started to shift to metrics, and I started to kind of feel uneasy because metrics and trust, metrics and relationships, what are they actually measuring? You
Right.
know, I don't
Yeah.
know. I think we have to, metrics are limiting.
Right.
Because we all hear this, but it's actually limitation. What gets measured gets done. Um, And I think we have to now think outside the box. And the point of metrics is accountability. And there has to be another form of accountability that can help to deepen trust, um, as opposed to metrics that create the look of trust.
Right. So I think as an MBA, and I've obviously been educated in all of these techniques and approaches to managing business. I look at, and the fundamental metric is always profit, right? I look at that as a very um, important thing to be aware of, but it should not be the driver. And the analogy that I like to use is, if you're in the ER, for example, an ER doctor and a patient comes in, the most important metric that you need to be paying attention to is the airway. Are they getting oxygen?
Mhm.
And so, just practically speaking, organizations need to have some lifeblood. You can't completely ignore the oxygen of your organization.
Yeah.
That's how you pay the people, that's why they show up. Yes, so maintain the airway, as it were, maintain that metric. But let's have a different vision for what we want our organizations to be. Do we want an organization that has an airway, but it's essentially living on a ventilator? Is that the quality of life that we're looking to create in our organizations? Yes, we have the metric being, the oxygen saturation is right, but they're on a ventilator and it's a very poor quality of life. Or are we looking at a much more expansive definition of what organizational success would mean? Are we looking at our employees happy? Do we have stable relationships with our supply chain? How is our customers' relationship with our brand doing? Is it strengthening? Is it weakening? Um, those are all things that I think we need to be shifting our vision to if we want to get to these sustainable, healthy organizations.
Well, a couple of things, because I do a lot of work with metrics, um, and objective and subjective. I find that organizations that use predominantly objective metrics, people become transactional. It becomes about meeting the goal as opposed to how the goal is met. Uh, I guess expectations, because they're not really metrics, but expectations that are subjective and well thought out help to improve the quality of the how. But then they're subjective. Some organizations use tools that kind of measure both subjective and objective. But over the past few years, they've been moving away from all of that and moving it into a different realm of measurement, because metrics measure the past and not the future.
Right.
So I have a different view on metrics, because it's I don't know if they've devolved, and they don't really but the clients that use like a combination of both doesn't really fully, when you look at um the distributions, because we check and see if there's a normal curve or whatever. Sometimes people playing with the curve and forcing it. All kinds of strange things happen when you introduce metrics and expectations. You have to take what has happened with some organizations. They start playing with the numbers with metrics, and so they're not always representative of the actual collectively. They're not always representative of the collective. And that's precisely why I'm saying, you know what, we need another form of accountability, because in many cases there's so much stigma associated with metrics and how people achieve performance levels and things like that, that it isn't something that's respected. People just go through the motions now, and they're not
Right.
excited about that process. Uh,
Well,
so
yeah, I go ahead, Yvette.
I just wanted to wrap that thought up. So when it comes to trust, we need another way of holding people accountable, because metrics can't really and truly measure trust. Even assessments don't really measure it.
Right.
um and we need another way to do it, and there are there are a lot of thoughts on what can be used instead of that approach. Something I think there's always a place for metrics. I think you should do analytics. I think knowing your numbers is important. So I'm not saying throw them out, but I'm saying we need a way to measure what's important, because it's not only about the bottom line.
Well, when you're describing this, Yvette, where my mind is going is again going back to these foundational ways of thinking. So currently, we think in these scientific ways, like for example, management in a university is going to be called management science. It's because we're operationalizing these kind of very systematic mathematical ways of seeing things.
Mhm.
And when you look at the origins of our current worldview, the scientific worldview, it's very much about seeing things through the lens of numbers. Newton, Rene Descartes, these are the kind of the big names in our philosophical underpinning. They were both mathematicians, right? And so
Yeah,
we
I
have
agree
been
with that.
taught to look at things through this lens of numbers.
Hmm.
But and I think what has happened over the years is we've lost a really, really important piece of the scientific process, which is the first piece, which is just to simply observe with our
Observation.
eyes.
That's right.
And so
Observation.
what has ended up happening is it's like we've almost, as a society, gotten to the place where our eyes are glued to the microscopes, and we're looking at this thing that we're managing, and we're taking all of these measurements and we're writing them down, we're putting them in our spreadsheets and doing our analysis on our metrics, and we're not even paying attention to what we're actually seeing. It's like
Right.
the only interpretation of this scene in front of our eyes is the numeric one,
Yeah.
which, like you said, it has value, but we're missing a lot of information.
Yeah.
And so I think as it comes to, yes, of course, like, should your Treasury Department be looking at the numbers? Yes, they should. But the leadership should be looking at the world not through this myopic lens of the metric. They
Right.
should be looking at it through their entire perception, which is not only visual, it includes listening.
Sensing. Right.
Yeah, it's all of our senses. So
Yeah.
it's touching base with people. It's deep listening to what's going on. That is the input that will get us the output.
Hmm.
If the leadership is just sitting there looking at the financial statements, they miss all of that information.
Yeah. Edwin, I couldn't have said it better. I think you're spot on because the traditional model relies heavily on metrics, and we need something else. I don't have an answer to what that is, but certainly how people feel is a big part of that. It's a
And
very big. Go ahead.
I think we talk about trust is really interwoven with feelings, right? And feelings is an inherently difficult thing to gauge,
Hmm.
but as human beings, we have the ability to do that, and a lot of that comes through listening.
Hmm.
Is we have to be willing to literally open ourselves up to that additional data. And I think one of the things that we struggle with, particularly nowadays, is we have so much information coming at us 24/7 that we spend a lot of our time trying to filter down that data, right? Exclude as much of the stuff that we feel is not just exactly what we're looking for. But it's through that kind of more open listening that we're getting the pulse and getting the feedback of what's happening.
Hmm.
And I think earlier you kind of alluded to this, but trust plays a balancing role.
Yes.
It's every ecosystem, every system, biological system is dynamic. And within that dynamic system, one of the most important functions is the self-regulatory function, the feedback loops that allow that system to kind of maintain the homeostasis. And if we're not using that sense of listening to gauge the feedback from what's going on, we find ourselves not um, not working towards the stability and homeostasis and the flourishing of our system. We find ourselves actually working against our system. Like we're doing things to exacerbate problems because we're not listening to the problem. And we see this in how maybe some people respond to illness. They're not listening to what their body's telling them.
Yeah.
And they will do things that make the problem worse
Yeah.
instead of listening and having the humility to say, okay, my body is trying to tell me something. And we
And
should be doing that in our organizations. My organization is trying to tell me something. I need to take a minute and listen to what it's really saying to me.
there's several things you just said there that I want to emphasize. One is that trust is a feeling. Technically, it's an emotion, and it's, researchers list it as an emotion, and as an emotion, other emotions can impact it. So depending on how you feel about someone that spoke with you, they made you feel, um, you know, they were condescending, so they made you feel small, or whatever they did. They shouted at you and they made you angry. Those or they embraced you with your differences, and they made you feel safe. Those experiences determine where you are on the trust spectrum, whether you're in a state of trust or distrust, or somewhere along that spectrum.
Right.
I think listening is also a very it's an integral part of the whole trust construct, as you
Right.
like to say, because sometimes when we're not listening carefully, we get triggered and go into a state that can lead to distrust or create a feeling that you're at risk.
Yeah.
And so the listening is a really important factor in the whole trust uh, function,
Right.
because from the inside out and from the outside in. Like when you're not listened to, you feel a certain way about it, and when you're
Yeah.
not listening, someone else will feel a certain way about you and it.
And
And
I think I think when you're talking there, what we're describing is these feedback loops within this area of trust. And
mhm, mhm,
in the end, again, I think the onus is on the leadership to engender trust, because that transaction of listening requires somebody to be talking and sharing, which is an inherently risky activity. So that leader has to be giving the feedback consistently, not just in the moment, but there has to be a consistent theme in that leadership's way of interacting with the people that they lead, that is saying, I am safe, I am trustworthy. So they're providing the feedback to the employee, if you want to say that. And when that person trusts that feedback, they will then speak honestly. And I think we've both seen, leaders who are um, um, retaliatory, or that unpredictable. People will not give honest feedback. They will just say what they know is the safe thing to say, what the person wants to hear. And it's incredibly disabling to somebody who's trying to actually lead, because all of a sudden now they're leading on false information, right?
yeah.
They're basically acting out on lies, because it's not the truth. It's what people know is the safe thing to tell them. And it's a cycle. It's a cycle of trust coming from the leader to the employee, and then the trust from the employee to the leader, and it's a loop.
Mhm. I think one of the things that I'd like to leave people with is we've been talking for about 45 minutes already.
Mm,
Um, is that trust is very relevant. It's not always convenient. It's not all when it comes to integrity and honesty and transparency.
right.
But it's very necessary. It's actually gone to a point where it's non-negotiable in certain circumstances, because it allows for organizations to be more flexible and agile,
Mm, mm,
um,
mm.
and
Exactly what I was thinking.
responsive in a global environment where that is not negotiable anymore.
Right.
So it's even though it's inconvenient to go through the process of building it, and uncomfortable, um and sometimes costly, because you might lose some good people. But in the long run, trust is a long term. We talk a lot about long term versus short term, but trust is a more of a long term strategy. You
Right.
want to
Right.
say anything before we
Yes.
As
And
we wrap up.
no, I think your thought there is exactly right. And I mean, clearly there are some businesses that are very traditional and in a sense there's not that evolutionary pressure on them. But when we look at the global the context now, the speed at which things are changing is increasing exponentially. The
Right.
levels of competition are increasing. We're now not competing in a domestic market, we're in a global market. So the core asset of an organization is that high performance team. And in order to be able to pivot, and you see this a lot in the tech space. I mean, companies, they're doing one thing and then something comes in along and disrupts the environment and they have to pivot and reinvent themselves. The fundamental property within an organization that allows people to be
Pivot.
flexible
Right.
is that core team trust, that they know they're a high performance team. They know everybody's strengths and weaknesses, and they know how to work together and execute, what they need to do. If you have a low trust environment, what generally happens with those organizations is they just kind of dissolve. They can't rise to the pivot challenge and they just cease to exist.
Yeah, yeah. They become too rigid.
Right,
S-
right.
So with that, Edwin, I'd like to thank you once again for co-hosting this
Yeah, it's
episode
great
of
talking with
Evolve.
you about.
Just say a few words about where people can find you, and then
Right,
we will
yeah.
sign
So
off.
I would love for anybody to reach out to me. I'm easy to find. My name is Edwin Clamp. You can find me on LinkedIn, or you can email me at edwin@edwinclamp.com. So love to
Right.
hear from some of you out there. Thank you.
Yeah, and I'm Yvette Bethel. I'm on LinkedIn. I have a website, organizational soul, orgsoul.com, or you can check out our courses that are IFB based at the IFB Academy, and the link is below. So this has been Yvette Bethel and Edwin Clamp. Once again, we would like to thank you for taking the time to join us on Evolve, Reinventing Leadership, Building Freedom Cultures.
Thank you for listening to Evolve, Reinventing Leadership, Building Freedom Cultures. Learn more about our proprietary trust, leadership, and culture courses and certifications at the IFB Academy. You can check them out at organizationalsoul.learnworlds.com.